Juliana Marines was a 26-year-old Brazilian woman doing what most people don't have the guts to do, traveling solo across the world, hopping from one country to the next, and just living life. She wasn't rich, nor was she famous. She just wanted to see the world, try everything, and feel everything. She had this spark, like she wanted to soak up every bit of life before it slipped away. So when she made it to Indonesia, she had already done yoga retreats, diving, pole dancing, and even lived out of a backpack for months. She was fearless. And then she saw Mount Rinjani. If you don't know what that is, it's one of the tallest volcanoes in this country. This huge, majestic thing is 3,726 meters of steep, rocky terrain, cliffs, and razor-thin trails. She signed up for a guided hike like a lot of tourists do. It's hard but doable with the right mindset, and Juliana had that. She was all in. At first, the hike was going okay. She kept up with the group. She was tired but nothing crazy. But somewhere along the line, as they were nearing one of the higher ridges, she started lagging behind. She told the guide she needed to rest, and here's where everything started to fall apart. The guide let her stop and said they'd meet further up the trail. So she stayed behind, alone on the side of a volcano. But no one saw what would happen next. Hours had passed and she didn't show up. See, the guy didn't go back for her right away, but when they finally did, she was gone. She had just vanished. They alerted the authorities and her family was notified, and search teams were called in. But the terrain was brutal. Even experienced rescuers had trouble navigating it. The forest was thick, the rocks unstable, the wind strong, and the drop-offs were death if you slipped off. It took them days just to get eyes on where she might have gone. Eventually, a drone spotted something, her body, or what they thought was her, wedged way down in a ravine like 300 to 600 meters below the trail. What was interesting is people said she moved in the footage. They said that she might still be alive. But when the rescuers finally reached her 4 days later, she was dead, and her body, well, had been destroyed by the fall. They did an autopsy and it wasn't exactly a peaceful death, not even close. She had multiple compound fractures, arms, legs, ribs, and her spine. Her pelvis was shattered, her skull was crushed, and her lungs were full of blood, not air. Her internal organs were ruptured, spleen, liver, and both kidneys. Her face had deep gashes from hitting sharp volcanic rock on the way down, and there were abrasions everywhere, like she had been scraped by hell itself. Her nails were broken off, maybe from trying to grab something on the way down, and her tongue had bite marks, like she bit down on her tongue in pain during or after the fall. The coroner said she probably couldn't even scream, as her lungs were collapsing from the inside. So here's what likely happened. Based on where her body was found, she must have gotten up to try and catch up to them, which is when she probably took one wrong step, or tried to shift her weight, which would make her foot hit loose gravel and make her fall. See, that whole part of that mountain is steep and unstable, and once you slip on volcanic rock like that, you're done. It's not like slipping on stairs, it's like getting thrown into a giant meat grinder made of stone. And she wouldn't have just fallen straight down, no, she would have actually bounced, tumbled, and crashed off sharp outcroppings, over and over. If she tried to grab onto anything, the rocks would have shredded her hands raw. Which is what she probably tried to do because her fingernails were torn off, maybe from trying to stop herself or maybe just from instinct. But the worst part, she actually survived the fall, although for not long, but long enough, and we know this because the official autopsy performed in Indonesia stated that her cause of death was internal bleeding from blunt force trauma, not instant brain death or snapped neck. That means her heart kept beating after the fall for at least several minutes, enough time for her body to attempt to circulate blood that was rapidly leaking into her chest and abdomen. So the trauma didn't kill her immediately. She laid there broken in the rocks, bleeding internally, her body twisting into shock for around 20 minutes. We also know it's around 20 minutes because the timing of her blood pooling after death and state of decay helped coroners to estimate that she died about 20 minutes after impact. So 20 minutes of her brain were still working, her heart still pumping blood she couldn't keep inside, slowly drowning in her own internal injuries. There was no way out, she was too far down, and no one could see her or hear her. The sky was foggy and the wind drowned out any sound. The search teams weren't even close to her. She died alone with her body crushed, probably unable to move, wondering if anyone would ever come. By the time they reached her, her skin had started to turn gray-blue. Her body bloated from heat and decay, and parts of her face were barely recognizable. Her hiking gear was torn, her phone was shattered, and the only reason they knew it was her was because of her ID and what was left of her hair. Her family brought her back to Brazil and they had a funeral, but it wasn't peaceful. People wanted answers. Why did the guy leave her? Why did it take 4 days to reach her? Why did it take death for anyone to care? But it didn't really matter. She was already dead, and unfortunately no one can do anything to bring her back. Malcolm Flynn was 72 years old, retired, healthy, and active. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't frail, and he didn't take dumb risks. He just liked to walk. And he did it often, long country hikes, always on public rights of way. They were legal, clearly marked footpaths across pastures and fields. He was part of a walking group and he followed the rules. He took no shortcuts, no dogs, just a quiet, deliberate man enjoying the outdoors. On September 11th, 2020, he met up with a friend, Ruth Henderson, for a route that crossed farmland between Cumbria and Northumberland. It was one of those familiar paths you stop thinking twice about, gently sloping hills, old fences, fields, and a simple walk. It was cool and gray outside with some light mist in the air. It was quite calm. So they entered a large pasture, and like with most pastures, there was cattle, and these cattle stood ahead, maybe 30 of them standing still and packed together, clearly watching them as most cows do. But for Malcolm, this wasn't new nor odd. Cows in the field were normal, and Malcolm had passed hundreds before. But on the other hand, Ruth felt uneasy and suggested going around them. But Malcolm said there was no need, since the cows weren't exactly blocking the trail, and they had done this walk before. So they crossed into the field, and about halfway through, the herd started moving. At first it was slow, a few shifting, then more. And then suddenly the entire group began walking, then running toward them. No warning and no time to debate, just heavy, fast movement. Dozens of animals, each weighing over 1,500 pounds, coming straight at them. It's really not known what the hell made them charge, as at least according to Ruth, they were just walking. But cattle aren't graceful when they charge. They don't see the way a predator does. They don't calculate, they just stampede. The ground shook and Ruth screamed, and then Malcolm turned. Then they were hit. Remember, Malcolm was an old man, being 72 years old, so it's not like he could run away fast enough. Same goes with Ruth, who was 67. Ruth was struck hard. She was knocked down, rolled over, and slammed into the ground. Something snapped in her shoulder and she began scrambling toward the fence, crawling on her stomach. Another cow clipped her leg, but she managed to squeeze through a low wire and crawl into a ditch. But Malcolm, on the other hand, didn't make it. The cows swarmed him, trampled him. Ruth, still dazed, looked back and saw only flashes of movement. Legs, hooves, brown shapes moving over something that wasn't moving anymore. When the herd finally slowed and moved off, Malcolm was left in the grass. His body was twisted unnaturally and his coat was torn. His face was unrecognizable, with the flesh across his chest having been crushed flat. Basically, all of his fragile ribs were broken, with some driven inwards, which would puncture his lungs. His skull had caved in at the front and side, leaving parts of his brain exposed. One eye was destroyed, his pelvis was shattered, and both hips were broken. There were also hoof prints across his back and stomach. The scene was more than violent, it was really an annihilation. His bones had snapped under the weight of multiple impacts, like sticks under a boot. His chest had been flattened. He had bled out internally, but the worst damage wasn't just internal. Much of his torso had literally been crushed into the soil. One paramedic later described it as like he had been rolled over by a vehicle again and again, but much worse. Ruth got to a nearby farmhouse and called for help, and the emergency services came quickly, but there was nothing for them to do. Paramedics examined him and immediately confirmed he was gone, with the cause of death being blunt force trauma, internal hemorrhaging, and massive cranial injuries. The coroner's report was grimly detailed. One line read, "Injuries consistent with multiple trampling events by large animals." Basically, he had been stomped on repeatedly by panicked cows, basically crushed. What was weird is there was actually no calf among the herd, and remember, they didn't bring a dog with them, and I doubt they made any sudden movements with them being senior citizens. Ruth also said they weren't antagonizing the herd, so either she's lying and they were, which I highly doubt, or I guess the herd was threatened by their presence, even though apparently they had walked past this herd before. This can only be summed up to the unpredictable violence of a herd. The story hit the local papers, some blamed the walkers, but there was no evidence they did anything wrong. It was a public path, clearly marked, no signs, no fencing separating them from the livestock, nor no warnings about aggressive behavior. No one was charged, the landowner wasn't fined, and the inquest labeled it as a tragic accident. Later, signs were installed warning walkers to avoid large herds of cattle, even if no calves are present. But none of that helped Ruth, who watched her friend die right in front of her, or Malcolm's family, who received his body in a state that could barely be viewed. See, there's a myth that cattle are docile. It's partly true until they aren't. They are big, anxious animals, and when something sets them off, they don't stop to assess what's in their path. Once they move as a group, it's chaos, and if you're in the middle of it, you don't get out. Malcolm Flynn didn't provoke them, he didn't run, he didn't shout, and he was on a legal footpath in a place he'd walked many times before. He didn't misstep, but within 15 seconds, his body was broken beyond recognition. It was an otherwise calm October afternoon in 2012 at a quiet equine rehabilitation facility in Ocala, Florida. The center sat behind a grove of trees, its building white and modest with the exception of one, the hyperbaric oxygen therapy unit. The structure looked industrial with solid metal walls, thick viewing windows, and a vault-like chamber inside designed to treat injured racehorses with concentrated oxygen under pressure. It was one of fewer than 5 chambers in the entire country, and was considered cutting edge in veterinarian recovery. Inside the building, 28-year-old Erica Marshall, an equine therapist and veterinary technician, prepared a session for a throat breed named Eros. The young woman had been working with horses for some years, so she was quite experienced with the practice. She had conducted this therapy dozens of times. Hyperbaric oxygen treatment was often used for leg injuries and tissue recovery, and Eros was recovering from a deep tissue injury in his hind leg. So Erica followed protocol. The horse was calmly led into the chamber and the heavy metal door was sealed shut behind him. The interior began filling with pure oxygen as the pressure climbed, which was controlled carefully via digital panels. The horse stood inside on a padded flooring, occasionally shifting its weight. You could see this because its movements were visible through the thick polycarbonate window, and at the start everything was normal. Then a faint sound interrupted the routine, a soft metallic crack, almost like a slow groan echoed from within the chamber. Eros, for reasons no one fully understood, began to panic. Perhaps it was a noise, a pressure sensation, or just a moment of fear. But he began pawing at the chamber walls, then he kicked hard. The force of his iron-shod hoof struck one of the interior panels with brutal impact. And that, right there, was when everything went wrong. In the blink of an eye, a spark erupted from within the chamber, possibly from a metal bolt dislodged or a static discharge triggered by friction. But whatever the case, in the chamber it filled with nearly 100% oxygen at high pressure. Even a spark is catastrophic, and what would follow wasn't just a fire, no, it was a violent, high-intensity explosion. The chamber ruptured in a blinding flash. The blast wave burst through the walls with such intensity that it blew out windows across the building. Shrapnel steel fragments, acrylic shards, bolts, and rivets sliced through the air at lethal speeds. The roof above the chamber tore open, sheared apart as though it had been peeled back by an invisible claw. To make this all worse, Erica Marshall had been standing right beside the control panel, less than 2 feet from the chamber itself. And, well, the explosion slammed into her with a crazy intense force. A jagged piece of the chamber's metal frame, nearly the size of a human forearm, impaled her torso, tearing through her lower chest and lodging into her spine. Her body was flung backward against a concrete wall, breaking several bones on impact. Her skin and clothes would catch on fire instantly because of the explosion, and the pure oxygen-fed flames raced across her body in less than a second, scorching her flesh with temperatures over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Witnesses would later recall that the blast was so powerful, it knocked 2 veterinarians off their feet and blew the door entirely off its hinges. The chamber itself was obliterated. Eros, the horse inside, was also vaporized in the explosion. His remains were scattered and burned beyond recognition, with charred bone fragments found embedded even in the chamber's shattered casing. Now, Erica would survive the initial blast for only moments, but her injuries were beyond catastrophic. In addition to the impalement and blunt trauma, she suffered massive thermal burns to over 90% of her body. Her scalp, back, arms, and face were blackened and seared down to muscle and bone in some places. Her airways were scorched from the heat and superheated gases, making it impossible to breathe. First responders would later report that she had no chance of any survival. One of the staff members ran to her, trying to extinguish the fire that still clung to her hair and torso, but the damage was irreversible. She died just minutes after the blast, lying among the shattered remains of the machine she had operated so many times before. The veterinarian on site was also injured, though not fatally. He suffered second-degree burns and lacerations from flying debris, but was mostly fine. Emergency personnel arrived to find the building in flames. The roof caved in above the chamber room, and fragments of the horse's remains embedded in the ceiling, walls, and even in the concrete floor. The fire department had to work carefully, fearing secondary explosions due to residual oxygen. An investigation was followed. OSHA and fire marshals examined every component of the chamber. Their conclusion: the horse's panicked kick struck a vulnerable point, either an access panel or a metal support structure, which triggered a mechanical rupture. And that rupture in a high-pressure, oxygen-rich environment led to a flash ignition. The resulting explosion unleashed enough energy to be lethal within a 15-foot radius. Basically, this rupture was equivalent to a small bomb. Despite being built for safety, the chamber hadn't been designed for the sheer force of 1,200-pound force kicking it in a confined space under pressure. Industry professionals, while shocked, acknowledged the danger, and it was a chilling reminder that high-oxygen environments are among the most volatile in existence. Because of all this, the facility shut down operations indefinitely and will not be opening its doors ever again.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.